Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. Today, it's what's on everybody's lips, masks. We'll be talking about that, as well as our federal parliament and asking what's happened to it. And then we'll be looking at what we hope to be sweeping reforms of our environmental regulation, which could be one way that we can actually get back to creating jobs in this country instead of destroying them. As always, in our Books and Culture segment, we'll have our spread of books and movies, including Mr. Jones, about a crusading journalist in the 1930s, McMillions, which is a show about people who managed to defraud McDonald's. And you might think that's a good thing, but a very entertaining show, apparently. And I'll be talking about a sort of a lockdown creative special out there in social media, which is Patrick Stewart doing one of Shakespeare's sonnets every day. To get through this variety of topics and ideas, I have with me, as always, my co-host, Chris Berg from RMIT University.
G'day, Scott.
Good to have you, Chris. Still in the bunker. In a different bunker, I have our Director of Communications, Evan Mulholland.
G'day, Scott.
Good to have you, Evan. Thanks for joining Looking Forward. This is, of course, a podcast of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au. We've got some great offers going at the moment about how you can join at a discounted rate, and then I'm sure you'll keep renewing for the next 100 years. And you can also find lots of our great content there. But yes, Chris, as I mentioned, Victoria, of course, is in lockdown. It started a nationwide debate over masks and whether we should wear them and whether we should be required to wear them.
That's right, Scott. So for a while, a month or so ago, it did look like we had in Australia escaped becoming a mask-wearing society. That is no longer the case. The Victorian government has now announced that it is mandatory in Melbourne and Mitchell Shire, which is just north of Melbourne, to wear a mask outside your home anytime where you're outside your home. There's a range of exclusions. For instance, in the classes that have returned to school, I think it's the year 11s and 12s, the teacher doesn't have to wear a mask, but the students do have to wear a mask. There are exclusions for young children, but for the most part, we are now in the mandatory mask situation. Lots of other states, jurisdictions, countries around the world have also got similar orders. In the United States, these are a huge controversy, which I think we'll talk about. But let's start with the basic question. Mandatory masks, not voluntary masks, mandatory masks. Evan, where do you stand? Where does your political philosophy view take you on the question of should masks be mandatory?
Yeah, look, I don't think they should be mandatory. I do think it's pretty common sense that masks would help in stopping the spread of a virus. And this is the kind of thing that should have been a first resort rather than a last resort. And I think this really blows the whole idea that we need to trust the experts to smithereens, because at the start they were saying they aren't effective in stopping the spread of the virus. And in the space of a few months, we've gone from they aren't effective to now they're now essential and they're now compulsory. So I think when the evidence changes so much, it really puts people off. And I think making it mandatory really just, puts people off and annoys people and probably makes people loathe the fact that they do have to wear them in the first place, rather than coming up with evidence-based policy that could encourage them to do so.
I've got some serious problems with this policy, but surely, Evan, there is a prima facie case for making masks mandatory, because it's obviously a communicable disease. This is obviously one of the most effective ways to prevent the communication of that disease. It's not like we choose to receive it or anything like that. So I find it hard to make a nanny state argument against mask wearing. It does strike me that in the same way that you might argue that we should have, relatively high vaccination rates and we should use the power of the state to enforce those rates, you could make the same argument about masks, right?
And I think that's a good point. Look, masks are something I'm not going to die in a ditch over. And I also think there's a counter argument to it as well, that if more people are using masks, it probably means we can open up our economy sooner. which is, of course, a good thing for lots of families and businesses and alike.
So, Chris,
Scott, where do you fall, Scott?
well, the libertarian objection, one of the things to it is we would never, no libertarian would object to requiring of masks, say, on private property. So if in March, Bunnings and Woolworths had have decided that you could not enter a supermarket or a Bunnings store without a mask, that would have been their business. Now, nobody could possibly object to that. But at that time, the WHO was out there saying, no, it should be reserved for emergency services workers and health staff. And this sort of determination of the nanny state to control the decisions about masks, the obfuscation about the evidence, and we have some belief that this was because they were worried about the supply of masks. So this attempt to control the messaging over the last 6 months has been one of the reasons why, at least in the English-speaking world, I think we've led to this sort of disastrous confusion and conflict over it, because it wasn't necessarily evidence-based at any point. I mean, in the East Asian countries, it was taken for granted. You know, it's a different cultural environment, but it's like if you're in Taiwan, it's like you wear a mask and that's fine. And whether or not it was compulsory, the vast majority of the population would have done so either. But now what I object to is, like Evan, it's not the worst thing to be asked to, or even told to wear a mask if you're going into a shopping centre or a Bunnings or whatever. But the nanny state wants to control it to the extent that they're saying you must put it on as soon as you walk out the door. So we're talking about walking down a footpath. We're talking about being in parks. Now, the Lancet study, which we might come to, talks about the efficacy of masks. This is about indoor environments, not outdoor environments. But why do they do it? So we had on ABC's Q&A. Here's just an example, but Jodie McVernon from the Doherty Institute. I'm sure she's a very well-meaning epidemiologist, but when she's asked the question, she doesn't resort to epidemiology. She says, practically the thing of having to stop and put a mask on before you leave the house is a reminder that it's not necessarily safe out there and the threat is not eliminated. So she's not saying wear the mask to prevent the virus spreading. She's saying we're passing this law because we want you to be scared and afraid all the time, rather than relying on the common sense of people to work out when and where a mask might actually be appropriate and when not.
It is a really interesting case study in the the communication side of the pandemic that has just been a really absolute disaster from day one. And continues to be. So the terrible messaging at the start of the pandemic about whether you need to wear a mask as an individual citizen was entirely driven by the fact that they didn't want us to go off and panic buy masks. And you can understand the reasoning there, but what it did is it made masks into this very, very unclear safety. We were all very unclear about the safety of it. And now it appears that they're doing precisely the same thing by telling us that we have to put on a mask in non-risky situations that they say are completely non-risky, like the moment you walk out the house, outdoors, in any situation where you're not running, for instance, when you're outside. Or overly exerting yourself. And that's being done again, not because of the medical evidence, but because of a policy communication or a health communication thing. And I think what this is really, this whole experience of the pandemic has underlined to me how it's not that the experts per se are talking about their areas of expertise, because epidemiologists have expertise in epidemiology and the transmission of virus between populations and within populations. But they are imposing some sort of pop psychology views on their recommendations. They're imposing some moral views on their recommendations that are quite separate to their areas of direct study that I just don't think holds up and under any circumstances is in their area of expert knowledge.
Yeah, well, I think you're right on that, Chris. I'll just add, case in point of that, Peter Doherty from the Peter Doherty Institute. If you have a look at his Twitter feed, half of his tweets are criticising the economic theories of the IPA and says, well, we shouldn't follow the IPA's trickle down economics and talking about Liberal Party politicians and things like that. So I'm pretty sure that's also outside of his expertise.
Yeah, right.
I do want to directly answer the question that I've been trying to push at you guys though on should they be made mandatory or not. Now I don't have a problem with mandatory masking.
Indoors.
In specific instances where the science clearly says that it is a necessary thing, because like you, Evan, if this is the trade-off for keeping the economy running, I will gladly pay that trade-off. If you recall, in Victoria for the last 2 weeks, we have been terrified about the idea of stage 4 restrictions. God knows what stage 4 restrictions would be, but we just know that they would be harsher. If the alternative to masks, mandatory masking in indoor settings, is stage 4 restrictions, I will gladly pay that trade-off. But I am deeply resentful about this manipulative psychological approach that says, well, if we're going to make masks mandatory in one situation, we have to make it mandatory in all situations. So it's easier to communicate the message to you and easier for police to fine you if they see you outside. I just think that is there's just no liberty argument for that. There's no externalities argument for that. There's no economic argument for that. It is just manipulation for the sake of manipulation.
Oh, that's right, Chris. Look, one last rant about this. One last rant. So just this moral framework also that it encourages is what Bella DeBera calls the curtain twitchers. The people who just love being able to get behind the nanny state, the mailed fist of the nanny state in this case, because I'll fine you if you've walked out of your door without a face mask. Presumably, there'll be a policeman outside every door. Today's Age, someone's written in and said, to make exceptions for special pleaders such as joggers undermines the intention and makes it harder to enforce the law, says Peter Barry of Marysville. I mean, for God's sake. But this confusion has led to what we've seen in America, where, like everything else, it's become politicised. And, yeah, the libertarian side of me, loves to see people not wanting to accept draconian laws, but somewhere in there the efficacy's been completely lost.
Yeah, this is worth actually talking about it, Evan. I'd be interested in your views on this, because it strikes me that what's happened in the US. So for listeners who haven't been following it, the idea of wearing a mask, whether it's mandatory from the government or mandatory from an individual shop, seems to have become a really significant culture war in the United States. Part of it is tied up with some of Donald Trump's, again, some strange messaging from Donald Trump about the virtues of wearing a mask, and some messaging from the White House itself that the president didn't think masks made Joe Biden look very manly. Now, it appears that the messaging is reversed again, because Trump has now been seen wearing a mask. And in fact, I'll read a tweet that he put up the other day. "We are united in our effort to defeat the invisible China virus. And many people say that it is patriotic to wear a face mask when you can't socially distance. There is nobody more patriotic than me, your favorite president." So some really strong pro-mask wearing messaging there. But what strikes me about this is that it appears that, or maybe it's just, isn't it devastating that we cannot manage these sorts of discussions, these sorts of policy responses, without filtering it through a culture war lens? Isn't that a huge problem? Evan, what's your view on that sort of culture wars aspect of the mask question?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting point, and I think it highlights a lot of difference. Often we say the culture is similar between the US and Australia, but I think it highlights a big difference on this debate. There didn't seem to be that big culture war debate, that big sort of left-right debate on masks that was had in the US. It just seems very unfamiliar to me, at least, that people would be debating the use of masks. As I said, it seems pretty common sense that masks would stop the spread of the virus. Especially if you carry the virus yourself, it would stop you from, and you're asymptomatic, for example, it would stop you from spreading it to other people. And there is some evidence to suggest that even if you don't have the virus, it could help you to prevent you from getting it. So it seems very unfamiliar for me that there would be a culture war going on. I think from here it looks very silly.
But isn't it a huge problem, right? And I worry sometimes that we're starting to have the issue in Australia as well, that it has become the only way some people can navigate policy questions, ethical questions, just practical utility questions, than through, well, the left want me to do this or the right want me to do this, so I'm against that. And, this is, those type of people want me to do this, those type of people don't. Isn't that a huge political problem that we're walking into, that the masks question in the US is really typified?
Yeah, I think, it's a big problem for the US because it doesn't really allow for consensus. And I guess you could bring in broader debates about, voluntary voting, pulling aside to extreme viewpoints. But the culture there does not really allow for a lot of consensus in the same way that we might see that here. Here you had on a range of policy areas, business and unions come together to sort out flexible arrangements for workplace relations. You had all sorts of different sides of the equation coming together for the so-called greater good. But where in the US, on the masks point, they seem to be going to polar ends of the spectrum. And I think sometimes in debate that's a really good thing. On this case, I don't think so.
Closer to home, Evan, one of the arenas that we do look for to manage debate, to hear alternative views, to actually achieve some kind of consensus on some issues, not on others, is Parliament. But you had a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald this week because Parliament has been punted once again. Tell us about that, please, Evan.
Yeah, that's right. Scott Morrison's decided to cancel the next 2 sitting weeks, which was meant to start from August the 4th. He says it's based on medical advice. I think it's pretty outrageous. I mean, Parliament's asking every single business to become COVID-safe businesses, to completely upend their businesses, rearrange their businesses to become COVID-safe businesses, and can't even do it themselves. I think it sends a really bad message to the community who have gone through so much. With all the billions of dollars coming out of Treasury coffers, with all the policies that are going through, we've got the most amount of spending on stimulus ever. Surely there's never been a more important time for Parliament to sit, and that's sort of what I've gotten into in the piece in the Sydney Morning Herald. Even if Scott Morrison said it's a no-brainer that Parliament should be cancelled, Matthias Cormann said it was not plausible that Parliament should go ahead. But if you look at the constitutionality, there doesn't seem to be any barrier to Parliament going ahead via Zoom, for example, as they did in the UK. It talks about the Constitution talks about voting by telephone or by postal service, or in such similar ways or wording like that, where it could be interpreted that looking into the future, our constitutional writers would have opened it up for other technologies like Zoom. So I think it could be done by either legislatively or changing the standing orders, and similar to basically what they did in the UK. At the height of the pandemic there, when Boris Johnson was even off with COVID, parliamentarians sent in their questions to Dominic Raab by Zoom. I think it's very important for our liberal democracy that that parliamentarians be able to scrutinise other parliamentarians and decision makers in the process which most Australians are familiar with, which is the national parliament.
It is absolutely outrageous, isn't it? Because as you point out, the idea that the entire economy has been sent to work from home overnight, So it's not like we had months and months and months to prepare and set up Zoom accounts and all that sort of thing. Everybody had to do it overnight. I'm not blaming the government for that. I completely understand why that happened. But it's just too hard for the parliament to do so 4 months into this crisis, when if they haven't been preparing for the possibility of a second wave, if they haven't been preparing for 4 months to do remote parliament, it is absolutely incompetent of the parliament. Now, whether that's incompetent of the parliamentary officers themselves, whether the parliament itself is unable to do this, whether it's the government that just couldn't be bothered, whether it's a bipartisan agreement that they couldn't be bothered. Parliament is not optional for them. This is their one job. There was a line that Scott Morrison had, and I can't remember whether I've got it here, but maybe you had it, which is he said something like it was
meant to be in their communities.
Yeah, it's more important that parliamentarians be in their communities. No, it isn't. It is not important that they're in their communities. It is important that they are representing their communities in the parliament that it is their job to do so. We need them there. And the idea that they can so casually dismiss it is obscene to me.
Yeah,
it's also nonsensical. What is it that they think is going to change late in August? We are going to have a low level, no, even in the best case scenario, we're going to have a low level transmission in Victoria for quite some time. They're just going to have to get used to this.
Yeah, well, and I don't even accept the premise that we had to default to some kind of electronic representation. Now, and certainly they have the capability. We know it because we've seen the articles about how the committees of government, say the National Security Committee of Cabinet and these various bodies have they don't use Zoom, they use very secure platforms that have been created for obvious reasons.
To interrupt, I do want to make a point. I've been on one of these government webinar systems. They are awful, absolutely awful. I've never had a worse experience than when I put on these damn things.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure you got the A grade treatment.
Perhaps not.
But yes, I'm not even sure I accept the premise of that. I think if you got to get the Army and Air Force involved in getting politicians to Canberra. If there's got to be special health measures, I mean, the building itself is bloody enormous. I mean, the chamber is a disgrace. The Australian Parliament originally followed the Westminster model and everybody was very crowded. And instead, when they built Parliament House in Canberra, they went into this cavernous space and lost the immediacy of parliamentary debate. But I think it's fair to say that horse has bolted. So this may be my one and only opportunity to kvetch about the design of a Jugular and approved by Malcolm Fraser that walked away from that Westminster tradition. Churchill was right after Jerry had bombed the House of Commons and he said, I want it restored exactly the same way.
Just put it back.
He rejected proposals to create a space that would have allowed them to actually fit in all of the MPs, which to this day they still cannot do in the House of Commons. But here we are in Australia, we have this cavernous space, allows for social distancing, this is my point, but we're not going to use it. And it's because there's thousands and thousands of hangers-on in Parliament. I bet you that's half the bloody problem too.
So, no, I think that's right. But whether it's virtual, so there've been some interesting experiments with virtual, and it is from my observations, and Canada's done it as well, that both the UK and the Canadian Parliament have both done their own versions of Question Time. Prime Minister's questions in the UK and Question Period, I think, in Canada. And they're rubbish experiences, right? But they are at least a simulacrum of parliamentary responsibility. It is easy to fill out the spectrum between full traditional parliament and complete remote Zoom parliament as well, as you pointed out, Scott. What if only the parliamentarians went to Canberra? Literally just the parliamentarians. Their staff can stay at home and Zoom. What if we said no lobbyists in the building? We don't need the lobbyists there all the time. We don't need the whole parliament there. We can have a small smattering of the parliament there. There's so many things that can be done, which is why it's so obscene that the government's just decided to cancel it. The idea that this is an option, I just find, if Parliament doesn't think it's an essential service, then, I said this on Twitter, I'll say it again. If they don't think that they can do this, they should dissolve themselves and we will vote in a parliament that does think it's essential. Because damn well, I think it's essential, and I think most of our listeners would as well.
I think you're absolutely right. And there is an important principle at stake here, and that is precedence. In Victoria, Daniel Andrews has basically cancelled Parliament indefinitely, suspended Parliament indefinitely. And then when the parliamentary committees were voting, their version of estimates tried to vote to put on some scrutiny onto the government for its measures and its actions taken, they've used their numbers on that committee to block all democratic attempts at scrutiny. So this is a very, very bad path for Scott Morrison to follow. He doesn't want to follow this path where he can just cancel Parliament at a whim. And surely, even if it's just for 2 weeks, these ones, they can use those 2 weeks to get their act together and figure out how the bloody well way to do Parliament virtually, because Canada and the UK have been able to do it. Why not Australia?
Yeah, and as Chris says, and as we've been saying on this show, it is time to start thinking not about eradication, which is a fantasy. We got to give up on this idea that we can get back to a world without COVID-19. It is about learning to live as Australians with some level of risk, with some level of infection, and right across the economy. And so this is just perpetuating the idea that you can kick the can down the road already, by the way. So at this time last year, the House of Representatives had sat for 45 days. So far this year, it's sat for 27. So the longer we go, the more that disparity is going to grow, and it's probably a good thing that they're not passing legislation, because most legislation just takes away our liberties and increases our taxes.
Legislation is a net negative.
Yeah, but the elements of Parliament that involve scrutiny should be wholeheartedly endorsed. And
because Parliament is not just about pumping out bills. I think a lot of politicians, unfortunately, think that is literally their job.
The ministers think it's their jobs to get through Parliament the bills that have been presented to them by their departments.
Yeah,
and that's how these things usually run.
Look, and it's nice to measure against something, but still. Speaking of legislative reform, Scott.
Yes, indeed. There is the prospect of some welcome legislative reform. It seems the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act provides that for a review every 10 years. And in this case, the government commissioned Graham Samuel, the former competition czar, and former investment banker of all things, to conduct that review, and he has presented his interim report, and we at the IPA are vitally interested in that. I think most listeners will be aware of our project to cut red tape, to unleash prosperity, to unleash jobs, which we've been running for many years now, and certainly there is lots of job-killing regulation that arises from the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act and the way it's administered and the lawfare that goes with it. And Graham Samuel has also said doesn't necessarily deliver great environmental outcomes. But Evan, you've been looking at that when it came out yesterday, and also organised the IPA's response.
Absolutely. There are good things that have come out of a review. Firstly, an acknowledgement from the government on their part in the Environment Minister Susan Lee that green lawfare is hurting investment. We've estimated that it's put $65 billion of investment at risk through green activists being able to tie up projects. We estimate a cumulative total of 10,100 days in court since the beginning of the EPC Act, which is just an insane amount of time. Green activists from the inner city challenging projects that they have no material relation to. So now, I think they will end up dealing with that Section 487 of the EPC Act through what I think is a very good proposal, is to accredit states to handle environmental regulation and environmental approvals. Because at the moment, if you want to start a development in Australia, you have to not only go through local and state government approvals, you have to go through federal government approvals as well. And as we know, there is so much overlap between those. At a federal level, we've estimated there's been a 445% increase in an amount of regulations in the EPC Act since the year 2000. There are some other good things. The government, the review rejected the need for a climate trigger, which is a hobby horse of green conservation and activist groups. They think there needs to be some sort of greenhouse gas trigger in the EPBC Act, governed by an independent authority full of unelected bureaucrats that could instantly stop any development from going through. So I think that is a excellent one. They were also wanting a federal takeover of all environmental laws. The government's rejected that, and of course said that they'll look to accredit states to handle that. There is calls for what they're calling, nationally enforceable environmental standards, and I think that could be very concerning and a cop on the beat in terms of enforcing
like a federal
law.
Like a federal EPA, which is like a holy grail of the green movement too.
Yeah, the government has rejected the police the Enviro police enforcement part, which I think is a really good thing. They're also talking about a free market approach to habitat protection, which I think could be really interesting. So they're looking at a few things. Graham Samuel, this is an interim report. Graham Samuel actually said he's going to get all these business groups and environmental groups together in one room and has invited them all to try to reach a consensus.
Not in one room.
One Zoom
still
call.
Waiting for our invitation, and very interesting that we haven't got one yet, considering I believe that the IPA's research in this area was actually the impetus for starting this whole process in the first place. So, a lot of the government's response echoes what we've been saying for many, many years.
So, what is your read of the politics of this at the moment? Because Section 487, which is the EPBC provision that allows gives environmental groups standing to challenge development applications, even though they don't have a direct interest in those applications themselves or in those projects themselves, has been a long-standing. Getting rid of that has been a long-standing agenda item of the coalition government. But for just as long as the coalition government has been in power, it's been a bit of a quagmire. That the government has privately believed that there's just no way they could get it through really any iteration of the Senate that they've been faced with. And I know, having spoken to some senior policy makers in recent years, they just don't know. They don't think it's going to get through, and they'd sort of put it on the back burner, if not gotten rid of it. Do you think this changes that, or are we still in the same situation? Is it different because of COVID? What's your view?
I think since the 2019 election, the political dynamic has changed. Labor are now grappling with these issues of resources jobs. You've had a Labor senator for Victoria, Senator Raf Ciccone, come out on the weekend and recommend that they should stop environmental groups from being able to litigiously challenge projects up in court. He says there is dignity in all work, and that includes blue-collar jobs in resources and agriculture and forestry as well. So Labor are dealing with this issue as well. You even had Bill Shorten, of all people, criticise the government the other day about a go slow on environmental approvals. I'm loving this new, right of setter, Bill Shorten, but his Labor opposition were, of course, the ones that blocked this reform in the Senate, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. So there is some change on Labor's part, not only on the emissions side, but on environmental approvals as well. And I think that will create the space for the coalition to have another go at this reform.
Yeah, well,
you think the coalition wants to?
I think they do. From the noises that they've been making on lawfare, on opening Australia up for investment in a post-COVID economy, I think I think they will have another go at this in the near future.
What they need to do is control the narrative, because the way this will be painted, in terms of this idea of devolution to the states that you talked about, this has been the missing piece in the puzzle from day one. Basically, 50 years ago, the Commonwealth had very little environmental regulation. And then progressively over time, it invaded the arena that had previously been the domain of the states, aided by the High Court through Tasmanian Dam decisions and so on. And what that led to was a tremendous amount of duplication, essentially everything being assessed twice, sometimes in conflicting measures. There's been various ad hoc ways to try and do that. This Act itself was passed by a coalition government under Robert Hill, trying to reserve that a little bit by saying, look, there's only a certain number of matters that the Commonwealth is interested in, and we just want to make sure any environmental assessment addresses those matters. But it hasn't worked out in principle. The Greens have always attacked, and Labor has walked away from sort of bilateral agreements between federal and state governments. I've been involved in the Basslink project in a previous life. It required an agreement between the Victorian, Tasmanian and Commonwealth governments to run one process, because otherwise it couldn't have been done. So, but how it's going to be misrepresented is the idea here is the federal government sets the standards, it sets the guidelines, and it sets the objectives. But the states can manage it. They can manage an environmental assessment process. So this is actually about finally dealing with something that is endemic to our country, which is the destruction of our federal system. This is about the state invading an area that had previously been in the reserve of the Commonwealth invading the states' prerogatives, and we have to get this right. Otherwise, we will never be able to present a system which achieves environmental objectives while actually encouraging investment and creating jobs. And it's such a job killer, because the other point that Samuel makes is everything's project by project. So the environmental protection can be the greatest schmozzle in the world, but nothing happens. There's no assessment of it. There's no work done until some poor bastard comes along and actually tries to start a project. And I've been through this. It's like, there's growling grass frogs. Well, we better go and commission a study of the growling grass frog, because that's never been done before. And that might take 2 years while we go and put a grid over the area and count the frogs, but we got to count them in summer and we got to count them in winter, and we got to go through a whole breeding cycle. And the next thing, you've lost a year, because no one's really worried about the growling grass frog in that area until someone came along and said they want to build a power station. So we have to get away from this project by project and ad hoc thing, and particularly with this conflict between levels of government. So if some good can come out of this, Australia will be better off, and I think the environment will be better off as well.
And it's an interesting time to... Sorry, go on, Evan.
I was just going to say quickly, I think in devolving in accrediting the states to handle the environmental approval process, it really unleashes competitive federalism and gives the states a stake in their economic recovery. If WA wants more projects and more jobs than Queensland, it can streamline its processes to be quicker in approving projects than Queensland. And you could have a system where all the states are competing with each other, rather than tying it up with Canberra and enabling litigious green groups to hold them all up. And
just sorry, Chris, quickly. And what the Greens will paint it as is competing to lower environmental standards, but you got it exactly right. It's not competing on the standards, it's competing on the process by which you get projects assessed rationally, quickly, decisions made. That's exactly the right place for competitive federalism.
These sorts of reports really bug me, because they follow quite a traditional model, and this seems like a reasonably good one, because it's quite clear about the failures of the existing act, and that it doesn't achieve its goals, and it is very costly. But it also just throws in a bunch of very 21st century policy recommendations. We need an independent regulator. We need to do this. We need to take it out of the hands of elected politicians, because they might have political impetuses on it and all that sort of thing. It is nonetheless a really interesting time to do this sorts of reform, because as Scott and listeners will know, I have been banging on about our need right now to myopically focus on nothing but economic growth. And if the government can push through changes, and I would recommend that the government push through changes recommended off the basis of the interim report, not just wait till the final report, then we could potentially be starting to do that rollback of regulations, rollback of the red tape burden that we're going to need to get the economic growth out of the crisis. This is the sort of stuff, to wrap it up, this is the sort of stuff which is why you would want a parliament sitting.
Yes.
But it is absolutely fundamental that the government be searching for and aggressively embracing the sorts of pro-economic reform measures that this might represent.
Now, we have come to that part of the show where we discuss our books and culture picks and what we've been reading, watching and listening to. And Chris, please take it away with Mr. Jones.
Absolutely. So actually, just last night, I finished watching Mr. Jones, which is a film about a Welsh journalist who also spoke Russian, Gareth Jones, who visited the Soviet Union in the 1930s, managed to get his way down to the Ukraine and provided some of, not the first, but some of the first-hand reporting of the starvation of Ukraine by Stalin. This is, as a film, it's not a bad film. It's got some weaknesses as a piece of movie mastery, but it is an amazing and very rarely told story, and in parts very affecting, about the horror of communism, the horror that communism in the Soviet Union wrought onto the people who didn't live in Moscow, we'll put it that way. Because the argument of the film is that Stalin was systematically starving Ukraine in order to fund industrial expansion in Greater Russia, around where all the politically connected people lived, and around where the Western journalists live as well. The film is correctly and powerfully critical of Walter Duranty, the New York Times foreign correspondent in the 1930s, who was an aggressive supporter of Stalin. In fact, I believe he may have coined the term, to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs. If he didn't coin it, he regularly used it both in print and he's quoted during the movie as using that. I'll make the obvious point. There are not a lot of movies. Certainly, there are not a lot of English language movies on the horrors of Soviet communism. I'm not going to be too political about that, but it is really remarkable how rare they are and how horrifying the experience was for people in Ukraine. Very confronting in some parts, very powerful in others. It has a weird cameo from George Orwell, Eric Blair, or an actor playing George Orwell, obviously, but highly, highly recommended for the sort of thing you don't normally see out of sort of a major Western picture.
I'm actually glad to hear that it didn't just cover him getting the story, but that the systematic attempt of Western intellectuals to downplay things that were going on in the Soviet Union is the complete disgrace of the whole thing.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about Walter Duranty to endorse this, but the story that they're telling is that Walter Duranty and a group of international correspondents in Moscow were basically just having one long-run party while simultaneously being supported by the Soviet government, so that they would just, live a great life in Moscow apartments on the Soviet dime, or at least with Soviet support, while pushing out propaganda back home. It really, really horrifying. There's a lot true about that. The New York Times has correctly written about how disgraceful Duranty's journalism was during that period. Durante won a Pulitzer for that. I don't believe that the Pulitzer has been withdrawn for his journalism. But anyway, so a moment in history and a period, an episode that is not as widely known as it should be, and has more contemporary resonances than are comfortable.
And where did you find that movie, Chris? Do you remember
I can't remember.
Which of the 400 streaming services it was on?
What a great question. I think it was an Apple movie, but I've got like half a dozen of them now. So
it's getting harder and harder to track.
It is.
Evan's going to talk about McMillions, and I've got no idea. Is that on Binge, Evan? It says yet another streaming service has just started.
Yeah, it's at Binge, which is a Foxtel spin-off, and it's on Foxtel as well. So it's a HBO documentary about, I think they call it something like the biggest crime you never heard of. So in the States, from 1989 to 2001, there were almost no genuine winners of the McDonald's Monopoly game. It was a $24 million fraud that corrupted the McDonald's Monopoly game. So it goes through 6 episodes, goes through inside the FBI investigation as to how this happened. You don't actually find out how they did it until the last episode. But at the start, they were actually, when the FBI started looking into this, they were actually quite concerned that it was an inside job and that McDonald's were in on it as well. And somebody was, cashing all the money. And as soon as they went to McDonald's, so, it would all be over.
The Hamburglar was going to be caught red-handed.
Exactly. So it goes through in-depth interviews with all the players. There's mafia involvement. There's drugs, there's crime rings, all connected to the McDonald's Monopoly game, which is really, really interesting. And the funniest part is in order to find who was doing this, they had to end up working with McDonald's and run the McDonald's Monopoly game for another year in order to find out and catch the person that was defrauding McDonald's of $1 million winners. So it's really, really interested. It's got everything you'll ever want. It's got drugs, mafia, crime, and McDonald's.
I find that bizarre. I love the idea that there's all these mafia guys sitting around in a room, and it's like, what should we do next? Should we rob a bank? Should we go and lean on a few guys and extort some cash? No one goes, no, we should go after McDonald's Monopoly game.
Once it was found out, it was actually it ended up being pretty big news in the US until 9/11 happened, and then all the FBI resources got taken away, so it didn't actually end up being put to the courts for a while after that. So it goes into that as well. It's really interesting.
Rightio. I have something a bit lighter and a bit happier. Attentive listeners will know of my fondness for Star Trek. I talked about the Star Trek Picard series, in which the 79-year-old Patrick Stewart made a comeback as the captain of former captain of the Starship Enterprise. A good show to get around. But he, of course, is a classically trained actor from England. And when the lockdown started, just for something to do, he read out one of Shakespeare's sonnets and shared it on social media, and it was so warmly received that he's then embarked on a project to read a sonnet a day, which he's been sharing on various social media platforms. I'm not someone who was familiar with Shakespeare's sonnets. I'm not or even Shakespeare's plays necessarily, but they're not very long, and they're only 14 lines each. So this is not a great commitment to watch a minute or two of something on social media. I think it's a very modern sort of way of doing some kind of cultural enterprise, and he's certainly got the Shakespearean cadences down. And the other thing I noticed. So I'll share a link where all these are being collected on YouTube. So Shakespeare wrote, I think, 120-something sonnets, and or at least there's 120 something which are in the bound together. I've then got hold of the exact same Folger edition of Shakespeare's sonnets that Patrick Stewart is using. I was about to call him Jean-Luc Picard. That Patrick Stewart is using, and it's the only way I could do it because it's got the guidance to the language and the footnotes for the obscure words and so on. So for anyone who's a little bit literary or missed the sonnets in high school or university, and you're looking for something a little bit different because you're sick of yelling at the camera every time, yelling at the TV every time Daniel Andrews appears on it, I can recommend something like this. And I did actually. Sonnet 55 I thought was good because this goes to a topic that we've talked about on the show. He talks about when wasteful war shall statues overturn, was a line that Shakespeare wrote a long time ago. And as we're seeing statues toppled all over the world, I thought there's nothing new under the sun. So I will share the link to the Patrick Stewart readings and guest readings by Sir Ian McKellen today on the occasion of Patrick Stewart's 80th birthday, and I'll also share the link to the Folger edition. So that's my culture pick for the week.
Very nice, Scott.
Thank you, Chris. But that has brought us to the end of Looking Forward, which, as I said at the start, is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you'd like to join or donate, go to ipa.org.au. And I'd also recommend you go to ipa.org.au. I think it's a /research areas /red tape, and read all about the problems with the EPBC Act and red tape in this country generally, and what we can actually do about it, some of which Evan quoted. A big thank you today to my co-host, Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott.
Our Director of Communications, Evan Mulholland.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Chris.
And to Mitch and Steve in the studio. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.